morning.
Good morning.
Morning. All right, we got some people still signing on, so we're gonna wait another minute or so, and then I will chat about the exam and how that went, because I did get it all graded yesterday, so. Okie dokie. So, let me open up the chat. Ooh, this has just become my whiteboard. Where I put things. Oh, here, hang on. I realize I have a virtual background, and while it's somewhat soothing, as I've told you, it looks kind of weird with my hair. So, I had to do a meeting in my bedroom the other day, and when I do that, I use a virtual background because I feel like it's unprofessional. So, but it's one of the few places in the house where we have a door we can close. This is all open to our downstairs. So, alrighty. So, as I sort of alluded to for you all, some people struggle on the first test. I'll give you the overall for the test, because remember, essentially we put together the in-class and the take-home, and that gives you a points out of 100. So for the total, we had 4 A's, 6 B's, 8 C's, and no D's. That's unusual, actually, for this test. Usually we've got a few people hovering there. And we did have a few people who failed, but again, you have so many points for this class. If you're one of those people, don't freak out. Please feel free to meet with me, make a Calendly appointment, and we can go over study skills for next time. And then the average overall was 72.82. So I always shoot for my exams to have an average in the 70s. So this is maybe like a point or two lower than I usually shoot for, but I don't curve because the entire class is points based and you have so many extra credit opportunities. The 480 students should be putting out their project soon. If I can get my butt in gear, I'll have a study out you all can participate in soon. So there's lots of opportunities to make up these missed points. Okay, so now I'll break it down a bit more. So for the in-class ones, we had, nobody got an A, which is a little unusual, but a lot of people got B's and even high B's. And this is one of the reasons why I do the take-home portion, is because not everybody, including myself, tests well in class. So, and then the average here was in the sort of CD range. And then for the take-home, people generally did better. Got 8 A's on that, B's on that, and then only a couple each of C's, B's. And the F's are honestly just people who didn't turn it in. So the average here was actually a C plus, B minus. So, and again, this is pretty typical. Actually, this is like a little better than I usually get. Sometimes it's like super bimodal, where it's like a lot of people fail and then a lot of people do really well. So this is a little closer to what I aim for on the first test. If by the end on the third exam you're all getting A's, I'm totally cool with that. A couple tips. So on the take-home exam, make sure you're hitting every point. There were a few people who on the last portion of the take-home exam just missed the point that said, like, make sure you incorporate the readings. It was like point D or E, I think, for question 2. So if you didn't incorporate the pieces readings anywhere, you got points off automatically. And I would say a good portion of the people who ended up with B's, everything was great, except you just didn't follow directions and didn't do that. So if you do that next time, you'll be great. And be blatantly obvious. If you look at it, you're like, yeah, but I was referencing X reading there, but I don't have a citation, or you didn't say in such and such reading. I don't know that. Right? So you got to make it really obvious where you're citing. And this is a good practice in general when you're writing in psychology. Typically when I write a paper, except for my results section, because that's all what I came up with, right? Every sentence has at least 1 citation. And some have like 5, right, for 1 sentence. You all don't need to be on that order, but if you are pulling something from the pieces reading, make sure that you are actually letting me know where you got that, or one of the readings on Blackboard as well. So, yeah, Debbie.
I was just thinking about that. Like, I was wondering if we needed to do like APA style citations, or just reference like from this.
And honestly, a lot of people just said like in such and such and such and such reading.
That's what I did, but I had that thought like, I hope we don't have to APA cite this.
No, this class is so low in our major, and we get so many people from other majors. I really only make my major classes do APA, so you're good. Thanks for asking that, though. So for the in-class, honestly, one of the most glaring things is there were probably 3 or 4 people who, I don't know if you just didn't get to them because of getting used to taking something online and the timing, but who just left all the short answers blank. You know, that was 20 points right there. So don't do that to yourself. I mean, if you feel like next test you're going to be rushed for time, start there, right? Because those are worth 5 points each. The multiple choice are only worth 1 each. So, you know, start there and then bounce back to your multiple choice if you need to in the future.
I do have one more question about that. Is there a way for us to see what we missed on the in-class portion?
I think it should show you. If not,
okay.
Play with the settings.
Okay, I looked at my grade, I didn't look real close.
Yeah, I think I have it set so that once I graded everything, it would show you all what you got wrong. But again, this is my first time doing it, so if I need to mess with the setting, let me know. Trying to think anything else. You know, multiple choice, you just have to get used to, you know, the multiple choice for a theory class, to be perfectly honest. They're a little trickier, and I'm not purposely trying to like trip you up. It's just harder to engage with some of this material, and that's, again, okay. Again, if you're freaking out about this particular grade, oh gosh. Okay, Megan, I will look at that. Thank you for telling me. It showed which one you got wrong, but not the right answer. So I will look and see if it lets me, I think there's a setting where I can have it show you the right answer, and I'll play with it after this class is done to get that. So thanks for letting me know. Thanks for asking about that, Debbie. Yeah, because normally I would hand them back, but I can't physically do that. So yeah, just, really reading the multiple choice carefully, and, coming back to them. I purposely made it so you see the whole test at once. It might seem long because of that. But if I do it question by question, you can't go back and check your work, and I don't want to do that to y'all. So, and that way you can go back and reference things, right? Because sometimes there'll be something in a short answer that relates to a multiple choice question, and that will kind of like jumpstart your memory. So feel free to scroll up and down as you're taking it. Again, if you are freaking out, please make a meeting with me. I'm glad to help you with any type of study skills or questions you had about this particular exam or how to approach studying. And also just know that people do better on the exams as we go forward. Again, the big thing that where people did the worst was just missing pieces of it. If you miss a piece, if you don't answer the short answers, the definitions, I can't give you any points for them. So make sure that you do that. Does anyone have any questions about exams in general going forward? Another thing I've done in the past that we can consider, and we can talk about it as we get closer to exam 2, is I've sometimes done review sessions where I just hang out and you all come ask me questions. And I could certainly do that over Zoom if we wanted before the next exam. So again, we'll talk about it as the next exam gets close. The next exam will cover Freud, who we're talking about now, and then it will also cover the post-Freudians, and it will cover Rogers and the humanists. So it's a nice mix of things that kind of go well together. And then the next one is sort of the more modern theories. So kind of piece that way. Alrighty, well, I'm gonna go ahead and first thing I'm gonna do, hopefully this will work, if not, I'll shoot you all an email, is I'm going to share a handout I usually hand out at this point in my lecture. So this is a chart looking at all of the psychodynamic stages. Yeah, it says there's some network disconnect. Okay, I'm gonna email it to you all real quick. So this chart, and actually while I'm doing this on another screen, let me go ahead and screen share the chart so you can see it while I'm in the process of sending it. Okay, so this shows Freud's stages. It gives you sort of the approximate age. It gives you the different zones that we'll be talking about. It gives you modes of tension discharge, key tests and experiences. It ties them to Erikson's stages, which we'll talk about. And then what happens if you get fixated at that stage. And we'll talk about what that means as we go through. But let me go ahead, I'll just make it an announcement and then you will get an email right away, plus it'll be on Blackboard, so. There we go. It's going to have the very exciting email title of chart. So, and then later on, I can send you the actual Excel file if the formatting comes out weird there. And I can bounce back and forth as I'm talking to reshare this as necessary. So if you're not familiar with Freud's psychosexual stages, or it's been a minute, maybe you talked about this in intro and that's been a bit ago, right? I want to go ahead and cover these in a lot more detail, but just to kind of set you up for it, essentially, Freud had this idea that things were tied to the body. And I think we started talking about this on Friday just a little bit, but I want to restart us at this slide here of linking urges to the body. So again, remember, Freud trained initially as a neurologist, so he really wasn't interested in how the physiology of these things might work. For him, that was part of trying to make this really scientific. So he tried to link these urges people have. Just realized that was like me talking to the back of a stage if I was acting, sorry. He tried to link these urges people have to the life force, to the body. And again, this came from his training as a neurologist and a neuroscientist. And in particular, he looked at what he called the erotogenic zones, which are parts of the body naturally sensitive to excitement. And so Freud assumed each of these areas also naturally generate tension and are related somehow to instinct. This is how Freud continued to develop his theory of dynamic consciousness while looking at development and looking at the body. So at each stage, Freud thought some sort of conflict arises. He thought that these were physical prototypes for psychological issues. And he saw these as a natural progression, that if nothing went wrong, you'd go through these various stages until you reached adulthood. And the evolution of the person really recapitulates the evolution of the species. Darwin's book, The Origin of Species, was actually published in 1856, which was the year Freud was born. So evolutionary theory and this seminal work by Darwin existed for Freud's entire life. All of Europe was influenced by Darwin at this time because it was so life-changing. So at each stage, these conflicts arise, and the way that you resolve them, to Freud, is what would shape your personality, is what might shape abnormality as well. And the way the conflict if the conflict is not fully resolved, then the child could get stuck in that stage. And Freud called this fixation. So if you were stuck at a stage, didn't move on for it, you were fixed at that stage, fixation was the term he used for it. And he thought that fixation leads to a less mature approach than obtaining sexual gratification. He said if all conflicts are resolved, the adult obtains pleasure from healthy, intimate relationships and from work. So essentially things we typically think of now as adulting, right? And so the stages that he had are the stages on your spreadsheet. So they are oral, anal, phallic, latent, and genital. And yes, there are two about the genitals technically. And then, as I mentioned, on your chart, you also have Erikson's refinements. So Erik Erikson, yes, that was his birth name, said that each of these stages presents with a crisis, some sort of conflict in your life between competing forces or competing sort of ways of being. And he says that how you resolve that crisis, the resolution of the crisis, affects unconscious themes that will shape your life, and then ego strengths that will affect the way the child views him or herself and the world. So essentially, your worldview is dictated, according to Erikson, by how well you can navigate these stages. So we're going to start by talking about the oral stage. And so this is from birth to 18 months. And one side note I'll say is, if you look at different textbooks, sometimes these stages, like the cutoffs will be slightly different in terms of age. So some people will say this is like 1 to 2 years. Some people will say it's only the first year of life. You know, it's more important to me that you vaguely know when these happen and the order they go in, to be perfectly honest.
So it's basically like the differences in people's opinions on length of breastfeeding.
Kind of, yeah, exactly. Yeah, good point. Yeah. So some people, you know, and this is very cultural actually with breastfeeding. Like some cultures will breastfeed until the child is 4 or even older. In our culture, we typically are happy if people can get to 6 months. And again, this is something I actually have been talking about with my women's and gender studies class. That's largely because in our culture, we don't have mandatory paid maternity leave, right? So a lot of women can't breastfeed because they've got to go back to work right away or risk losing their jobs. So we do have FMLA, which is sometimes called FEMLA, but that is unpaid. So that just guarantees they have to keep your job for you. And it's only if the company is like X size. So if you're working for a very small company, they aren't obligated to provide that for you. It's one of the things I think we need to think about as a country. If we're going to be really focusing on family values, right? Perhaps we should make maternity leave available and paternity leave, but that's just me. But yes, exactly the same type of conflict. So in this stage, the mouth is seen as a source of pleasure or of conflict. So breastfeeding, which we just mentioned, or, you know, using a bottle for those who can't breastfeed. And also the baby communicates orally, right? Communicates through crying. And I used to think that people were kind of nuts when they said, oh, you'll learn what your baby's different cries mean. And I was like, a cry is a cry. Like, what? Like, for Quinn, I could definitely tell what her different cries meant. So certainly that is the case. So the argument here is that the source of pleasure or tension is the mouth, the lips, and the tongue. And this makes sense if you've been around kids this age. If you hand them something, the first thing they're going to do is put it in their mouth. And this is why you have to be really careful with things with like small parts around this time, because they'll put it in their mouth and they'll swallow it, right? And you don't want them choking or, you know, whatever it is being stuck in their digestive tract, right? So this is the way that they understand the world. It's also the way they discover the world. So one of the reflexes babies have when they're born is called the rooting reflex. So if you stroke their cheek, they'll turn their head that way because it's a reflex that helps them learn to find the breast and suckle. So the conflict here is weaning. So this is when you are moving away from breastfeeding to, you know, maybe bottles or solid food, depending at the stage. And the idea that Freud had here was that the id is the one who wants nourishment here. Again, he argued that babies and very small children are mostly id, right? They haven't developed the ego or the superego yet. And so then it becomes excessive pleasure versus dependency. So the idea is kids could be afraid of not being able to fend for themselves. And I just realized I printed myself a copy of this, so I'm just walking over to my printer to grab it off of there. We invested in a laser printer before the semester started, and it's one of the better decisions we've ever made. So yeah, again, looking at your chart, which is in your email, here we see that Erikson calls this crisis trust versus mistrust. So the idea here, again, pleasure versus dependency. Is my caregiver someone that will actually respond to me, right? Or are they going to ignore me? Or are they going to be too indulgent and not let me go like explore my world, right? I mean, babies need to learn to crawl away from you and come back, or when they start walking, you know, walk away from you, walk to your spouse or whoever. So the whole idea here is, can I trust that when I cry, they will at least try to figure out what I need, right? Because with babies, sometimes they're just crying to cry, and you know, sometimes it takes you a bit to figure that out, or they're just overtired, what have you. So The idea is, as a parent, you want to be supportive, obviously provide for their physical needs, show them love and care, but not be too smothered, right? So what we'll see as we go through all of these is that they're all like that. You gotta sort of walk this tightrope, and like, if you mess it up, your child's gonna be messed up. This was Freud's idea, was that caregivers, primarily mothers, were responsible for essentially everything that went wrong in someone's life. We now know that that is not necessarily the case, right? Unless there's something huge that goes on with your caregiver. But part of Freud's legacy is that for many, 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 many years, and really there are still some people who do this today, people just assume that if you were having any kind of psychopathology, it was because your mom messed you up when you were a kid. The other conflict here is biting. So kids like to bite things. And again, we don't want them to be biting things that shouldn't, right? We don't want them to swallow anything. Also, if you are breastfeeding and they're biting, that's really painful for the mom. Certainly you want to start to set limitations here. So again, referring to the chart, the character type here is the oral personality. You get fixated at the oral stage. Again, here we're thinking about dependency, right? They might be too dependent on others, demanding, gullible, jealous. Their theme is I get, and again, that mistrust, trust, can I talk to people? And again, this last column, I would say doesn't have any real research behind it, but this was, again, the theory that people sort of conjectured, is that this might be related to schizophrenia early in life and later to paranoia and depression. Again, not something we see a lot of in this day and age, but again, all of this stuff has a little kernel in it where you can be like, okay, I think I can see where he was coming from. And here it's, yeah, you give something to a kid, they stick it in their mouth, right? All right, so the anal stage. So at the anal stage, the pleasure is derived from the anal sphincter, right, Todd? And there's greater focus on defecating and urinating, but Freud focused much more on defecating. The idea here is that kids begin potty training, and this is the conversion of involuntary behavior, right? Kids can just go wherever for the first part of their life because they're using diapers. And then you have to learn to make that voluntary. You have to learn to hold it in, right? And you also have to learn how to let it out when it's time to do so. It's the first attempt at controlling instinctual impulses. So it's the first time the id isn't just allowed to do whatever it wants. The id isn't winning, right? So they derive praise from their parents for completing potty training. And, you know, traditionally, punishment at this stage has targeted the buttocks, right? So spanking. I think that is becoming less and less popular in this day and age, but certainly still a thing that happens. And one thing that I'll say here is that I think the anal stage in particular is where Freud's theories, one of the places where Freud's theories have really gotten into the popular culture. And even if we just think about, if we think about saying, oh, that person's so anal, right? What we mean is they're uptight, right? They tend to hold things in, right? You know, and there were two sides of the anal personality to Freud. So there was the anal retentive, holding everything in, and then there's the anal expulsive, just letting everything out. And this is not always literal, right? It can sort of translate to other areas of your life. So kind of the perfect example of the two anal personalities is if you have ever seen the old movies, The Odd Couple. Okay, it was about a set of male roommates, and one of them was anal retentive, very fastidious, very like everything has to be in its place, and the other one was a complete slob, anal expulsive, right? The other way this has gotten into our vernacular is honestly some of our swear words, right? Like, oh, he's just so full of shit, right? Like that, a lot of that comes from this, which again, people don't necessarily realize. But yes, the idea is, you know, again, if you're stuck here, you might either go the like sort of OCD route, or you might be the opposite, right? And you might just be like, everything can be everywhere and it's fine. And so Erikson called this autonomy versus shame and self-doubt. And Erikson really focused more on the idea that what you should try to do at this stage is let the kid start to explore their world and make decisions. So the story I always tell about this is one of my colleagues, her son, when he was around this age, just hated to wear the same color socks. Like his thing was he wanted to wear 2 different color socks, right? And his parents could have like made a big deal about it or said, you know, no, that's not right, or made fun of him. But his mom just went with it and was like, it's a lot easier to do laundry now. I just dump the socks in the drawer, right? And so they were letting him build that autonomy. And the idea that Erikson had is if you're not allowed to do that, then you might start to doubt yourself. You might have shame. That might lead to, say, negative self-esteem later on. Again, a lot of how your parents can F you up, right? Which we now know, yes, that can affect you, but there's so many other things that can also influence it. Everybody's favorite, the phallic stage. Right, so again, hopefully you're slightly familiar with this from intro, but if not, it's a whirlwind. So we are going to take a lot of time to chat about this. So the phallic stage, as you can see, is like 3.5 to 6. It's essentially the preschool years. And the focus here is on the genitals. So it's about pleasurable physiological sensations and conflictual feelings that might arise as regard to this. So children might start to notice the differences between girls and boys here. I obviously don't remember this. I was too young, but apparently I came home during the stage and told my mom, did you know boys have a penis? You know, it's just, you know, I was in preschool and some little boy mentioned it. So, and they may fantasize about sexual acts and masturbate. And again, this throws people off because we don't necessarily like to think of kids as sexual. And I don't know if we know that they fantasize about sexual things. This is, again, one of the main sticking points where pretty much everybody who came after Freud disagreed with him about this particular piece. But kids this age do masturbate. My mother is now a retired preschool teacher. When I was home in the summers from college, I used to help her by subbing in her school. And at nap time, we'd have to say things like, keep your hands above the blankets, right? Another great example of this is on the show House. There was just a short case while he was doing his clinic hours where a little girl's mom brought her in and the mom thought she was having seizures. And House was like using all these euphemisms to try to explain that, no, she's masturbating. She doesn't know that she's masturbating, but she just found something that feels good, so she's doing it. And so he said, she's finding Nemo. And the little girl went, and the mom's like shocked. But yeah, kids are exploring their bodies. And in fact, there's even evidence that fetuses, while they're in utero, explore their bodies in this way as well. It's, again, modern research shows it's not actually sexual per se, it's just kids figuring out their world. And again, this is the biggest point where even his closest sort of allies or followers were like, right, we don't think so. All right, so the Oedipus complex is the biggest piece of this. So this is based off of the Greek tragedy written by Sophocles. And in it, Oedipus sort of goes away and then he comes back. He doesn't know who they are, but he kills his own father and he marries his mother. So he's unaware of the taboos he has transgressed. And when he finds out, he blinds himself. So, good comedy, very uplifting. No, right? It's a Greek tragedy. So, Freud's idea was that children had the unconscious desire to possess the opposite sex parent and do away with the same sex parent. So again, this is not literally sexual, even though Freud sort of hinted there was an element of that. But even Freud says this is the unconscious wish to have the mother all to himself. He used boys as the prime example here, as he did with most of his theories. And basically the idea is you get rid of dad and then you don't have to compete with dad for mom's affection. So the conflict here is that you love your dad, right, if you're a little boy, but you're competing with them. And you also might fear your father, and this is where the idea of castration anxiety comes in. Boys, again, little gems of this might be true. Sometimes we see boys who are especially fond of their fathers or of their mothers, and girls who are daddy's little girl, right? But like, not all kids are like that. Like right now, Quinn's in a really big mommy phase, and I'm sure she'll go through a daddy phase at some point too. Who knows? Or she's in a grandpa phase. It's not always exactly this, right? But this idea of castration anxiety is fear that the affection for mom by the little boy will be met with emasculation by dad. So the dad will take away the little boy's phallus so that the child can never be with the mother. So then the kid makes the decision that it's best to become like the guy who has his mother, right? So like his father. And this is what Freud called identification. So the little boy started to identify with the father, this process of identification. And it marks the beginning of the resolution of the Oedipal conflict and the successful resolution of the phallic stage. So there's this mixture of love and affection for the father, but also this fear of father's reprisal. So that's boys. What about girls? So Freud argued that girls just went through the Oedipal complex too. But he said because they couldn't identify with dad, if they did their identification, it had to be with mom. And again, remember, we're in Victorian Austria. So mom is not out in the world working or involved in politics or anything like that, right? So Freud actually believed little girls couldn't fully resolve this stage the same way boys could because they can't develop that super ego. And so they essentially are just sort of always kind of stunted compared to boys. Scientists came up with a lot of bad excuses for sexism, racism, xenophobia throughout the years. And we're still doing it, unfortunately. I don't know if anyone's seen the reports coming out about the hysterectomies. So they're just doing it on immigrant women. I thought that was over. It's in the 70s. Apparently not. Apparently we're still doing eugenics. Great. What a great country. Just like side note, I actually really do love America, and I know that we have a lot of great things here, but I don't like these ways that we're harming other people. Just sort of put that out there. Now, one of Freud's followers, Jung, who we'll talk about next week, he called the female version of the Oedipal complex the Electra complex. So he gave it its own name. It's again related to a Greek story. And so Jung really believed girls could resolve this, just like boys could. So again, already starting to diverge from Freud. The Freud-Jung breakout was like Fleetwood Mac, man. Like they just like stopped writing each other letters. It was bad. It was very high school almost. So what Jung kind of came up with for girls is that girls realize they don't have a phallus, right? They don't have a penis. And so they experience penis envy, where not having a penis is their castration anxiety. And the idea was the girl blames their mother for the lack of a penis. She desires her father, yet at the same time envies him for his penis. And Freud, again, was vague about how girls actually resolved this. Other theorists kind of fleshed it out a little more. So again, the process of identification, boys identify with their fathers to overcome the wishes for their mother. And eventually girls will identify with their mothers to overcome anger at not having a penis. And both boys and girls are then prepared to later seek out members of the opposite sex for marriage and procreation, was the idea. It's a lot. It's a lot in this preschool age, right? And if you look at the chart here, again, in your email or on Blackboard, the zone here is the penis and the clitoris. So exploration, manipulation, curiosity, playing. And the P task is this identification, resolving the Oedipal conflict or the Electra conflict. Erikson called this stage initiative versus guilt. So to me, this always feels a lot like Erikson's previous stage of autonomy versus shame and self-doubt. But here, Erikson talks more about sort of the moral judgment, right, of kids that are exploring their bodies and how you can give them essentially like guilt, shame, almost this like religious crisis, right, when they have, when you sort of teach them their bodies are not okay to explore. So the phallic character, if you get fixated here, is daring, seductive, and vain. There's sort of a lack of purpose. And here is where Freud did the majority of his therapy work, because most of his patients he saw, he diagnosed with what at the time was called hysteria, which was the idea that your psychological symptoms would manifest physiologically. So he saw, for example, women that had no physiological reason but couldn't feel their arm or couldn't move it, or spoke a language that they didn't remember learning, things along these lines. It also is related to paraphilias, which are the sexual disorders in terms of things like pedophilia, things along those lines, and also phobias as well. I very inadvertently, one year when I was teaching abnormal, was teaching about the sexual dysfunctions and disorders. And I was talking about how when you're treating sexual dysfunction, you could treat it just like snake phobia. And then I just stopped and was like, didn't mean to do that, Freudian slip. I sometimes jokingly call this the curse of Freud, where like whenever I'm teaching Freud, I make at least one Freudian slip. So expect that to come up in the next few days. And we can all be embarrassed together and then laugh at the ghost of Freud. So the phallic stage, again, Freud's biggest linchpin of his theory, where everybody else was like, I don't think so, Stigman. Freud said then you're basically elementary school age, 6 to puberty, and all that stuff goes latent. So you're just basically going to school, there's a little psychological development, you're essentially learning skills and abilities necessary to take on the role of the adult. Freud believed there are essentially no conflicts at this phase. It was a time of rest and latency. You might just be expanding social contexts. Erikson calls this industry versus inferiority. So the main thing you're looking at is competence. So kids start to compare themselves to their classmates, right? Ooh, well, like I'm better at him than math, and he's better at me than football, right? Start to figure out sort of where they lie. And Freud thought all that sexual stuff just kind of goes away during this period. And again, maybe there's a grain of truth in that if you think about, kids thinking the opposite sex has cooties and things like that, right? At the same time, you certainly will have kids within this range who get little crushes and whatnot. So, funny fact about me, which I don't think I've told you all yet, is that I went to elementary school with Pete Buttigieg, who ran for president, from kindergarten through 3rd grade. And I was convinced I was going to marry him. Obviously, even if I'd stayed in the area, it wouldn't have happened because he has a husband. So, but I can remember clearly having this crush on him at that point in time. So the idea that this is a latent period where all that goes away, again, maybe not. Now, one thing I don't think I've mentioned in a lot of detail is that Freud didn't actually treat that many kids. He mostly worked with adults. So a lot of this stuff came from retrospective report, adults reporting on their childhoods. There was, in fact, his daughter Anna, who we'll talk about, who is the one who works with kids and started applying his theories there. Then there is the genital period. So this is around the age of puberty, adolescence. So this, to Freud, is where the overt sexual and aggressive desires came from, and emergence of interest in the opposite sex. So this is, again, like little middle school boyfriend, girlfriends, or partners, right? Where you like go to the mall together and like hold hands and meetings, right? That kind of stuff. And then there's also kids who are like having sex at this age. So, there's the whole spectrum. Sexual needs are satisfied through socially acceptable means like dating and eventually marriage when you get to that age. The libido is focused only on the genitals. And he said there's no specific conflict, that you only get here if you resolve the conflict at the other stages. So one of the ways to think about fixation is to think about it as an army. At each stage, there's this battle, there's this conflict that Erikson's talking about, right? And if the resolution of a stage is incomplete, some soldiers must stay behind to monitor that particular conflict. It's as if some psychic energy must stand guard, lest the psychosexual, conflict break out again. The poorer the resolution, the more the psychic soldiers have to be left behind. And one consequence of this is that there's less psychic energy available for the subsequent tasks of maturity. The more soldiers brought forward to the genital stage, the more the psychic energy can then be invested in mature, intimate, and productive relationships, and the better the adult personality adjustment. And a note here is that to Freud, successful personality development was the ability to productive and to maintain heterosexual relationships largely, although interestingly, he didn't think of homosexuality as a disorder in the way that a lot of other people did. He just said that, maybe they're fixated at one of these other things. So according to Freud, personality development is largely complete around the age of 5 or 6. The adult personality is dependent on how well the conflicts that arise during infancy and childhood are handled. And again, if that's what you think, then of course you're going to blame the parents for what happens in early childhood, right? And what we found out since then is that, again, yes, if something goes horribly wrong then, kid is abused, loses parents, that type of thing, it can affect you. But by and large, kids are pretty resilient, like even just physically. I don't know if anyone's been around a toddler when they like run into something and they just like keep going. You're like, are you sure you don't have a head injury? Cool, right? So kids are pretty resilient. So the idea here is, for Erikson, is identity versus role diffusion. How are you going to identify? How do you start to move into those roles? Now, note here is that Erikson kept going with his stages. Erikson's stages go all the way to death, assuming a death in old age, essentially. I know that not everyone is able to experience that. Freud stops here. Freud says, you get to adolescence, you're good. Even though, again, he was only working with adult clients, and so he saw that that clearly wasn't necessarily true. But again, he blamed everything on conflicts that arose during these times. So according to Freud, this trajectory of moving through these stages in this order was non-negotiable. It was inevitable. Everybody has to negotiate these stages. And it's individuals who experience the problems, who have to leave their mental soldiers back, will have adult personality characteristics represented by that stage, be fixated at that stage. And, again, another thing to kind of note here is that Freud's not saying, you get fixated at the oral stage and you're just going to act like an infant for the rest of your life, right? He's saying, no, to be your psychic energy, a part of it's left there, and in times of stress, you'll sort of revert to those behaviors. So things like people with oral personalities, in Freud's mind, in times of stress, would be more likely to develop things like alcoholism, right? Or be someone who chews their nails or chews on a pen, that type of thing. Alrighty, so we will stop there for today, and we'll pick up with neurosis on Wednesday. And I will do my usual hanging on for a couple of minutes in case anyone has any questions. If not, I will see y'all later.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
I just wanted to let you know that I had a lot of trouble logging into Zoom today. My computer was, I don't know, wasn't working, and I emailed you.
Okay.
I wasn't able to resolve it, so.
I'm glad you were able to get it in. Yeah, it's frustrating. I know.
Yeah, I wanted to tell you because you're gonna log into your email and you're gonna have like a couple emails from me, like.
Okay.
All right. Thank you so much. Bye bye.
Yeah, thanks for letting me know. Glad you got in.